So welcome. My name is Tejal. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Welcome to Tejal Yoga Community Hour. About each month, we don't stick too rigidly to each month, but we like to gather and bring in a leader in wellness that is doing work to really address issues that they see are gaps in wellness. So we like to talk about hot topics, and in the past, we've had conversations on bridging building bridges in mainstream wellness, how to actually get over the hump of being someone who feels othered and still making a presence for yourself in mainstream wellness. We've talked about divesting from mainstream wellness and investing in authentic indigenous practices and practice holders. We've talked about things like sci-fi, writing, and mindfulness. We've also done group tarot readings. So these community hours really span the gambit of topics and considerations, and they're a lot of fun, in my opinion, because it's a great way for us to gather intimately as a community. So thank you for being here. And I want to thank you, Rabia, for being here to guide us through actually two conversations. Today's the first of two conversations we're having about children's yoga or kids yoga. And today's topic is on kids yoga ethics. So I think we're going to have a really wonderful conversation because it's one of those um, basically patterns of yoga behavior that has gone a little bit unchecked, but also has become overregulated. So I hope we get to dig into a lot of the nuance. And then I want to share with you that there will be the part two, which is actually you can come to that even if you didn't really sit in on this conversation on January 17th on Tuesday. It's going to be a 1.5 hour workshop on how not to appropriate kids yoga with Rabia. So, Rabia, how are you doing today? And while I give you the floor to kind of introduce yourself and share with us how your week has been, I'm going to drop in the chat the check-in that I would invite everyone here to type if they're available to do so. Yeah, and that is, what is your name, your pronouns, your location, your land, if you know it, and what brought you to this conversation specifically. Rabia, would you like to check in?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Rabia and I use she, her pronouns. I'm located in Tonkawa land, colonized as Austin, Texas, y'all. And what brought me to the conversation has been a journey, I think, for me, trying to navigate the school system as a student, and then also as an educator. And simultaneously, my journey of incorporating yoga, mindfulness, Ayurveda, wellness into my life and seeing the intersectionality and now being at the crux of where I feel like they can have a relationship together. So what brings me to the conversation is I want to really open dialogue around how we're approaching this, how it's currently being done, and how can we create more, I guess, more of the way we honor the traditions, but also focus on how children are taking in the way that we're teaching.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that too because I have nieces myself, and we have these conversations amongst us, and it's just a fascinating conversation because they are so young, but they're at an age where they're starting to manage the difference of what yoga is at home and what yoga is in cosmic kids yoga. And it's a really young age to have to really make that distinction and change behavior and manage like two lines of thought. So for me, I'm excited to hopefully get to a place where we don't have to have kids managing like the duality.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
something that's coming up in the chat around what brings you to this conversation is that kids are scary, LOL, and I want to be less scared of them. Like
Kids are
hashtag real
scary.
talk.
Kids are very scary.
Yeah. And we also have someone who currently teaches teens at a mental health center and teaches autistic kids between the ages of 5 and 13. So this conversation feels very applicable. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
amazing. I have a background in behavioral therapy, so I've worked with incorporating mindfulness with autistic students for a very long time. So I can also talk a little bit more about that. Thanks for sharing.
That's awesome. And then someone else is here who has a young niece and nephew, a couple nibblings, and they know that you practice and love to do poses, but you want to make sure that you're being mindful and practicing with them.
Mhm.
Amazing. Amazing. So yeah, we're gonna we're gonna maybe take away some fear of kids. We're gonna think about how we work with the kids in our life and also how we teach as
Mhm.
teachers. So this is really wonderful. Well, I guess my first question for you is really the foundational question, which is what kicked off your kids' yoga journey?
Mm. So, um, I think it would kicked it off with like what I kind of said in the beginning was it was a very personal experience for me as a student trying to navigate the school system. So I grew up in a community of color in a low income school, and I didn't have a ton of resources navigating the school system. My parents are immigrants. And so there was always a barrier. But at home, I had my practices. So I had yoga, I had Ayurveda, I had mindfulness. And though there was like this on and off switch that I've had to turn on. And if you've ever been in conversation with me, I often call it like the Hannah Montana phenomenon, where it's like I have to be two very different identities in different spaces. Um, so while I felt like I couldn't necessarily incorporate those tools into the school system or have that be where I receive them, I felt that there was a level of foundation that I had in terms of how I'm navigating with my nervous system, because it was a very isolating experience to go through the school system with immigrant parents who don't speak English. So these tools, in many ways, equipped me and my nervous system. And though it's wreaked havoc, it's also had this basic discipline of feeling supported throughout college, throughout high school, elementary school, all these different spaces. And even if I wasn't conscious of like, oh, I'm going to incorporate this tool right now, it felt like it was ingrained in that moment where I kind of knew where to take a pause, take a deep breath. So for me, I think the journey started as a student itself. And those things stayed very separate of my personal practice and how I navigated the world. So you go about this prescriptive way of how you live life and all the different systems you find yourself in, and then you get out of school and you get a job and all the things, right? Um, and I feel like that intersectionality for me, like it's very obvious of like how beneficial this could be. But that dialogue it's always stayed separate. So for me, it wasn't even something that I was on the forefront of my mind. I would say it was when COVID started, and a lot of students were first out of school for a very long time. So when they did join back in, that too virtually, there was a lot of catching up to do. There was a lot of burnout on the educator end of like how to navigate all these different systems, because in Texas, the mask mandate lifted pretty quickly. So there was a situation where some students were at home on their computers and there were some students in person, and the teachers navigating how to teach now to this hybrid situation. So in this situation, we see like children normally getting really agitated. There was higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of hopelessness, and all the things that we're trying to see with children, and the grades are dropping, retention rates are not really going great. And for me at that time was like, okay, let me come into this space and see why this makes sense, because to me, again, it's very obvious, but it's not a normal conversation that we're having around. So we start incorporating wellness tools, mindfulness, breathing techniques, yoga poses, asana, things of that nature into the curriculum for children. So this would be like a 20-minute class once a week, spanned out over like one school district to start off with. And immediately you see like over like a 6 week period with the research background, for me, like surveys and data is like very important. That's another language that I speak of. I think that's like the additional love language for me. So it was natural in that moment to have like data, because that's also how you legitimize the science of yoga and Ayurveda in Western spaces, is to have the data to back it up, to show that this is in fact the science. So we have these pre-surveys, we have the post-surveys, and in the pre, I also see a lot of hesitation from educators, because it's like, well, this is one more thing on my plate to help navigate, and I'm very conscious of like how this would impact them. So to also incorporate tools for them, but make it easier that I come in, I practice, and you're also welcome to be a part of this practice instead of doing classroom management. In the surveys after like a 6 week period, which then went on to like 16 weeks, was like, this is making a noticeable difference in my classroom. The children are feeling better. And then there's like children surveys of like, I feel better, I feel calmer. And then examples of like, oh, when I feel angry, I do this. When I feel upset, I do this. So it's just at that point, I'm seeing the data. I'm also seeing the difference. And I'm like, this makes so much sense for us to continue to incorporate in the school system. we live in very unprecedented times with how children are receiving education, but also the underlying fear that a lot of children experience going through the public school system. So how can we as individuals or educators make it so that these tools can become more accessible for children? How do we make it part of their core curriculum? Currently, getting my master's in education because this kind of kicked off that for me. I wasn't in this space where I wanted to go back to school because who does, but we all do. So in that moment when I decided to make that decision was very much motivated around the results I had from incorporating wellness into the school system and realizing that there has to be systemic change around how we navigate how children are receiving these tools. It has to be a fundamental part of how children are now going to navigate this world that we live in with what could be known as ongoing pandemic, with what could be known as the lack of safety in schools. This has to be a part of how we equip children, just like we are with geometry and algebra and English and all the things that we think they need to know. This is one of these of how we're creating the foundation for how they're going to navigate themselves in and outside of the school system. So that's carried me on to now get my master's in education to get into more legislative change of like the dream being here of mindfulness to be a part of K through 12 core curriculum and even in higher education spaces so that children like myself and all other children that have immigrant parents that have gone through the public school system that have had experiences with lack of resources in their schools have some form of foundation with self-empowerment that as we continue to navigate these unjust systems, there's still a space for us to continue to breathe and reset and not feel completely burnt out before we even get into the post-secondary space. So that's been a little bit of my journey.
Yeah, no, I think you took us through the journey from the beginning to now, which is
Yeah.
great. There's so many more questions I have for you, and I just want to
Mhm.
encourage everyone, if you have questions, also drop them in the chat. But so much of what you said resonated with me personally, just because of the feeling of not knowing what the heck was going on.
Mhm.
Because at home, it was a different culture, it was a different mindset
Yeah.
than it was at school. And then I even felt that way up until I would say first year of undergrad because of the huge transition of going from high school to a really large university and having lectures being 200 people, that being such a new experience, and felt totally unequipped for that.
Mm.
So for me, I think one of my philosophies is like, how can we provide more support in various ways to people to simply exist in a peaceful way, right? Because
Mhm.
there's so much inner turmoil, there can be so much external turmoil. You
Yeah.
stated it. We're educating students in an unprecedented time where they need to be more skilled than they ever have in certain life or death situations that are
Mhm.
coming up in the education spaces that they go to.
Yeah.
So, really, really fascinating to hear how you're kind of moving through your journey and deciding
Yeah.
to move forward with your master's in education for the purpose of being in a legislative seat or
Yeah.
role. But I guess when you think back to not just your experience, but your experience with students, what are what comes to mind as something that has happened that has made you feel so uncomfortable and part of your desire for change?
Yikes, what hasn't? I think that this has been such a turbulent journey of, where when I talk a little bit about of how helpful it could be to have these tools, and to me, when I say it back, it makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, like, yeah, we know that these things work. Let's incorporate them in the school system. Let's create a strong foundation for the children. This all should be great. And it's not like that. I think the biggest thing that was appealing for me with working with children, especially, was because I've had a lot of time working with adults and existing yoga teacher trainings where we're working to like revamp, decolonize, deconstruct, and having a lot of hard conversations around, well, I've known this for X amount of time. How do we go back? And the fragility that comes with it. With children, for me, that I thought was almost beautiful was that we are that first introduction of what yoga looks like, right? Or what mindfulness looks like, or what Ayurveda looks like. So instead of like having this unlearning, we're just learning. And I think that's always been so fascinating to me because you create the framework and you have the responsibility of now being able to introduce it in the way that it's meant to. However, with that, if you're working in a school system, there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape around like what can be introduced to children. So for me personally, it's just a little bit more tension around not necessarily what the children were taking in, because there was so much fascination and curiosity around what it was and the way that I explained it as a science, the way that I spoke about the brain, especially in like different age ranges, but around like what can and cannot be said. So for me personally, it was uncomfortable because I have these experiences with adults in these Western spaces of colonized yoga, of like why things are uncomfortable in this unlearning and just the fatigue that comes off with dealing with that fragility. And now it's like the same thing, yet my mindset is like the pressure is higher for myself of like, but if we are the first introduction, we have to do this right. We have to make sure we have the responsibility of like as a teacher to give them the tools in a way that's going to be sustainable, that's going to make sure that it stays with them, that they understand what they're doing, that they're doing it in the right way. Having that pressure on myself and then getting that pushback of like, well, you can't use Sanskrit, well, you can't say this, well, you can't do that. I felt like personally for me, it was very uncomfortable of just like, how do I navigate this like responsibility of myself of wanting to do this right? And also thinking about how much authority I have in this space, how much autonomy I have in this space, and how much I can incorporate of all that I'm talking about. So there was a lot of back and forth around what can be said, how it can be introduced, a lot of nuances around like the verbiage around certain things, to have deep conversations. And a lot of that, I think, like even before getting into the classroom, was to have conversations with people that are adults, like principals and staff and faculty and teachers that already have a very crystallized view of what they think yoga is. So the people that are in positions of power are what allow me to come into the system and then to make that systemic change. But there was so much backlash just at that like introductory level of getting in there and what I'm going to say and what I'm going to do. And I'm back at that space now of like, I have to talk about, well, it's not a workout. It's not this, it's not magic, it's not woo woo, like all the language around what this is supposed to be like. So it was just uncomfortable and like feeling initially very hopeful around what this could be like, and then kind of getting this like reality check of like, no, this is going to continue to be difficult, but it's going to be difficult in many different ways, because even to get in to have the conversation, you have to kind of make a case for yourself. And I live in Texas. I was in the Houston school district. So someone that looks like me comes in, wants to talk about something that I want to talk about, it's not received very well. And then in the spaces where it was received well, or people were advocating for me, I became a token, because now then I had to also have hard conversations with people about how they feel. And then there was this like, oh, this person has a capacity to take on like my own personal discomfort around yoga. So there was a lot of like interesting dynamics that I don't think I was prepared for. And I think my hopefulness like went out pretty quickly, but it came back when I had access to the children. I think that's what made
Mm-hmm.
it worth it. But it was that initial layer of like, how do we even get in the conversations that you have to have? And then what's the parameters and like what I can say and how much time I have. That was very
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
I think what gets missed in the conversation, but something that happens a lot in ABCD Yogi conversations, is all the additional labor that gets placed on the teacher, that gets placed on the person that is actually a hopeful in offering a practice that is more aligned with the indigenous ways, or more authentic and cultural and spiritual than
Mm-hmm.
physical or monetarily valued. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's definitely part of the conversation. And yet, you're still navigating the discomfort in order to uh, essentially reach your vision, which is
Mm-hmm.
to share that yoga can be decolonized, and the way to practice it is through a decolonized approach that will give the maximum benefit. So
Mm-hmm.
in the work that you do now, I also want to say that in the So You Want to Chant Om and Namaste workshop, we talk about the politics, and we talk about the legislation that has been passed in Georgia, Alabama, and California that then informed the way India was able to push yoga in schools, to the public school system, which is a
Mm-hmm.
form of neocolonialism, which is to say
Mm-hmm.
that the way India practiced yoga was shut down during several periods of colonization. And then it was kind of reformatted and given back to India or approved and said, you can now practice yoga, but only in a certain context and in a
Mm,
certain format and way. And then that is what traveled to the West, which is then what is being used as um, the way to practice yoga or mindfulness, quote unquote, in schools with students, which is essentially a watered down version of what the yoga was in the first place. And
mhm,
then what's gone on now, this other additional like stream of activity is that then this has become popularized in the US. And because of the US India relationship via colonization and via essentially colorism and becoming closer to whiteness, the US is using the argument of yoga in the India is using the argument of yoga in the US as a reason that this works in the school system.
mm,
And it's just a very complex trajectory. But what happened in the US, in California, which was really surprising to me before I really understood the landscape of California and how divided it really is here, um, was that in California, there were a group of people that were arguing the yoga was too spiritual, the yoga was too Eastern, the yoga was teaching religion, um, and that needed to stop. And then what happened is that on the legislative side, the judge and um, basically the county decided that the parents were wrong and that the way the yoga was being taught was already watered down enough that it was appropriate for the kids. And so what happened from that ruling was the whole handbook on what you can and cannot do with kids in school with yoga. And it eliminated the use of Sanskrit. It eliminated the use of mandalas, mudra,
mhm,
any
mhm,
other chanting that was not in English. I don't even know if chanting is allowed in English, but it basically restricted the practice so much that it's left to calisthenics and stretching classes and noticing your breath, which is valuable, but it's not actually the approach of pranayama or yoga practices. So
mhm.
that's what happened in California. That a little bit of that happened again in Alabama and Georgia. I'm not entirely sure if Texas statewide has a mandate on that or if it's down to the district level. But what are some of the restrictions that you're dealing with in specifics?
Yeah, so definitely Sanskrit is a big no. And I think that there's on an individual level, I think there's like varying like receptivity on it. But I think just like school wide for me, I've noticed like it's just it's not a thing that's accepted at all. So I think that they are okay. And it got to a point where it's like, so if you've interacted with children's yoga, they have like completely different names for poses, like not even like what they're translated as. It'll be like something, because we have to make this into a game. So I had to even have that argument of like, well, can I still use the English translated name versus like an animal name that you want me to use because this is what you think is going to be more receptive for children. So even to have that translated version in English was a whole conversation, which was uncomfortable because to me it makes more sense to be using the Sanskrit. But even then, like in adult yoga spaces, say you're not using the Sanskrit, you still use the direct translation. With kids
Mhm.
yoga, there's a whole different language around what you're using, and there's all these names around what you're supposed to be saying and doing that I had to familiarize myself when I was in this space. And I'd be doing it, and I would say a movement to someone, and like, okay, I don't know what it is. I would do the movement, like, oh, and that's such and such, like obscure bear something name that has like nothing to do with any of this. So there was a lot of like language situations where we had to really, really hone in on like what are we saying and how are we saying it and like the general politics around that. Um, and the second part of it was it had to be a very movement based class. And that went very back and forth because a lot of teachers would then complain to higher ups or other people in faculty to give that feedback back to me like, oh, like I want my I want the kids to get their jitters out. I want them to like, shake, or I want them to do that so that they can concentrate, or this is what I want for them. It's like, well, that's not what we agreed on because that's not, I'm not here to just teach that for that reason. So there was a lot around like the teacher and faculty and staff feeling like they had more autonomy of like what was going to be done, and I was basically just the conduit of that situation. It wasn't that I had any expertise in that. It was just that, oh yeah, we could use yoga because the kids need to move. And so let's have someone come in here and help them move. And when they weren't moving, because we're talking about how what the parasympathetic nervous system is to like, eighth graders, or when we're talking about trauma informed practices with younger children to give them more autonomy, to them it was like, what is happening, what is she, it was like almost as if it was like very radical practices of what seemed very baseline to me. So it was a steep learning curve, I would say, on both ends of one understanding like, wow, this is like very basic stuff that we want in here. But I would say like my what felt like to me was I almost felt like a PE teacher, like a physical fitness, physical education person of like, I'm just supposed to come in here and help them move. Like if you went through the public school system and, randomly your music teacher comes in and you play those little useless little flute like things and then they go away. That was
Mhm.
like what seemed like my role of like, I come in, kids have an activity and then we go away. And now we have a problem with the activity person because she's not doing activities. She wants to breathe and talk about like feeling your belly and all this type of stuff. And it's like, but my kids aren't moving. So it was, I think a lot of the conversation was just around like, how do we even talk about this stuff? What's the language around it? Can I not use wild names for what the poses are? And then around like, how much flexibility do we have in what we can do in our time together and how it encompasses the entire practice instead of just movement.
Absolutely. I think what's coming up is the definition that I use for accomplice. And that is when you are an accomplice, you are willing to take direction from the key stakeholder of the initiative. And what is actually showing up is that we have moved so far from yoga being a place that yoga comes from a place and it comes from a people. We've moved so far from that baseline knowledge that the key stakeholders are completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So yoga, it comes from the place of South Asia. You can zero it in on India and Pakistan before there were borders of those countries. And it comes from the people of those places. And so we hear a lot of discussion, do South Asian people need to be the advocates for yoga as an authentic and rooted, culturally rooted practice? Not necessarily. That doesn't need to be your role if you don't choose it to be your role, but you are still a key stakeholder of that practice. In some way, shape, or form, there is an investment on what happens with that practice because of your identity markers. And you can choose to care about it or not. But it sounds like we've gotten to a point where we have no um, option in the matter. If someone else outside of our heritage deems us as not a key stakeholder, then that's what goes, right? Even
Mm-hmm.
though it was your presentation and your project to bring this into the school space, someone easily said, oh, well, I've seen them do this in other schools. So now I have some ideas that I want to bring into it. And instead of it being fully collaborative, it was just, you're not a key stakeholder, Rabia,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is really alarming in how far we've gotten from the roots of yoga being a part of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we also see that in terms of being able to offer it in the education space, there needed to be so much extra advocacy and education to the other faculty and staff in the space, rather than just an acceptance that there's something that you're bringing that will be beneficial, even after
Mm-hmm.
the studies, right? It was like a usurping of of your of your ideas and what you're bringing to the space constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I just find that really fascinating because it expands out of the kids yoga space, but I think we've gotten so far away from allowing kids yoga to be as connected to yoga as it is rooted and
Mm-hmm.
aligned with.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some questions. Wondering if you want to take those questions in the chat. What's the line between teaching authentic yoga and catering to the kids' parents and admin?
Yeah. Um, I think it's like different with each circumstance. And I think it also has to do a lot with like where you're located too. And I say that because I've had a stark difference in the conversations and the initiative that I've had tried to have in Texas versus anywhere else. So I think a lot of like where you're located has a lot to do with how receptive certain people and places can be. But I found that it's very case by case. There is some there's some situations where I would have certain feedback from parents of like, this is really working, or they also themselves are practicing a more authentic form and are, up to expectation with this. And there's also then me having to water things down, and then the same parents coming back and like, well, this is not yoga because they have a broader understanding of what it was. So it's a little difficult because with children, then you have all these different layers of the people that are speaking on behalf of them. And you want to be able to, as a taking that responsibility, you have to be able to cater to all of them because that in the end ensures that the child is still getting the resources. But it's so difficult in that sense because then to please all these different systems, by the time that the tools reach the child, it's not at all what you had envisioned for how you want for them to be introduced to it, for how they receive it and how they go and implement it in the world, because then it almost kind of feels counterintuitive to like the initial part of how you started. I think it's a lot of, I've been a very big advocate of like putting myself in tough situations and having tough conversations and continuing to see and be in spaces where I know like are well intentioned and, let's come in here, let's do the grassroots type of work. But I think over time I've learned about self perseverance. And I've also kind of understood around like there has to be some form of like a vetting system of how you're putting your energy out there. And to me, it was I had to be very cognizant of my identity, of my name, of what I look like, and the implications that has of how much I can drive a conversation in certain spaces. I could have a white counterpart that could get through to the conversation much more efficiently than I would be able to because there's a lot of stopping, talking over me. There's a lot of questions, a lot of fragility. And so as I'm noticing a lot of this, I think in speaking for myself personally, it had to become a vetting process of where and how this energy is going and to continue the work, but then to also understand that there will be just no matter how hard you try in certain situations, there's going to be some level of pushback. And is it something that you can work with, you can work around, or is it just making it absolutely impossible for you to do what you want to do? And I think it was for me, like I came in with like a whole bunch of like naivete around like, oh yeah, this is going to be great. Working with children, this is going to be energizing. This is going to be that first introduction, and not realizing the complex systems behind what comes into a classroom. Um, and also even understanding this was not something that I knew, but like the lack of funding in public school systems that are, I guess, like millions of dollars of debt constantly. And so you're working for what it doesn't seem equitable at times, but also to know if you want to continue the work, you have to, for your own self and your own perseverance, be in spaces where at least you can be in the building with the conversation around this is, you're not hiring me to carry out a plan that you have. You're bringing me on board because you agree that what I have in store works for the students, that's going to help them in their retention levels, and that we're going to collaborate in the space together. I think
Hmm.
for me over a few years is like just putting myself in all these spaces, and I'm like, and white owned spaces, and coming out of them incredibly depleted and feeling like a token and feeling like what was the point of the work I did? And now thinking that the work is important and I feel that it needs to continue. And that's what's driven me to be more in like a legislative space and thinking about systemic change. However, we still have to think about there will be some spaces that are just not going to be open to receive the message that you have. And so continue to find yourself in spaces and conversations and with people that are going to amplify, but also be on the same page of allowing you to bring in the material that you have with them creating the space for it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I want to offer some more to that, but you framed it so beautifully in terms of your experience and what you've learned through the process. and self-preservation being key, knowing when you are running yourself ragged, and there will be no fruits of that labor because of opposing forces and how loud and large
Mm-hmm.
their voices can be. I think if you are considering going into a space where you're teaching youth and um, it's important to understand the structure of the system. How interactive are the parents in the system? What role do they play in the curriculum, in the offering that you specifically will be making? Um, that's one element of it. Also, what has been done in the past, and are you stepping in to fill a vacancy? And if that's the case, does there need to be a resetting of expectations? Does there need to be like a lot of information gathering so that there can be a clear understanding whether this is a complete break from what was happening previous and then an introduction to something new, or if it is a continuation and there is a sameness there? And in terms of the like the entire administration or the program lead, I'm speaking from the experience of having taught at the Administration for Children's Services in New York and with training in mindfulness for at-risk youth and practice in that. Um, I think it's really important to know what are the existing regulations and rules upon a practice that you will call yoga. They may call it something else, but what
Mm-hmm.
is it that they are saying can and can't be allowed in the space based on um, the building administration regulation, based on the local regulation, based on statewide regulation, and how does that impact the offering and the longevity of your offering in terms of budget and in terms of continuation and in terms of renewal? So it's
Mm-hmm.
also assessing like if you only have X amount of time to do what you wish to do, maybe it's kind of like, I'm going hard with all of my aims here
Mm-hmm.
because there's something that I know I won't be able to be here for too long. But if there is an idea for long-term growth in the program and you have the opportunity for 6 weeks assessment, 16-week assessment, whether it's done through the administration or whether you offer that yourself, like checking in, informal check-ins, maybe even sending personally like created surveys. I think that plays a part in how much of the approach you want to offer is disseminated in what way, right? Is it
Mm-hmm.
everything all at once, or is it piece by piece, and we're going to assess how it goes over time, and then just continue to excavate into the space of kids yoga that you feel is missing or is a gap. Um, there also, I think, has to be an element of damage control when we're talking about the different languages of the poses. The kids themselves might be really confused and might push back a
Mm-hmm.
lot and say, "Oh no, this is airplane. Like this is an airplane pose. This isn't what you're calling it. This is
Yeah.
crisscross applesauce. It's not easy seat. I don't know what you're talking about." And so there's an education component that might come into play that isn't as practical as a movement or breath work or yoga asana focused practice. And then kind
Mm-hmm.
of assessing how much time and space there is for that re-entry
Yeah.
into the practice or re-education.
Yeah.
Yeah. It becomes a lot, and I think it actually is dictated by the regulations that are already in place, and
Mm-hmm.
then your desire to be a part of that system already, or whether there's opening to change within that system.
Yeah.
We have like a little bit of time still, but I want to address something that came up at the start with one of the participants here, which is, how can I offer yoga in a way that feels aligned and authentic? Really, all that's to say, how can I offer decolonized kids yoga? Because so much and pretty much everything that's out there, without that stated, this is a decolonized framework to kids yoga, is a
Mm-hmm.
colonized version of yoga, is a
Mm-hmm.
way to say, we just want kids to move. We just want kids to breathe. So we're just going to do whatever we need to do to have that happen, which is a
Yeah.
similar argument to adults who say, I just want people to experience yoga no matter if it's goat yoga or hip hop yoga or naked yoga or etc. Because you never know what that journey could look like for that person, when actually that initial entry point, which you had been talking about earlier, is so very important, not from a
Yeah.
perfectionist mentality, like it needs to be 100% right away, but from the mentality that this is impactful and this is foundation making. So I guess the question really is, how can a person in their own context, whether they're just practicing with people that are in their life, whether they're actually going into the school system, whether in another kind of children's center or space or community center, offer a decolonized kids yoga?
Yeah. I think it's first important to understand like the way children are receiving yoga right now. So you took the name of like cosmic kids yoga. So if you're familiar with it, it's a lot of storytelling around how children are receiving yoga, and none of these stories have to do with yoga. They are like animated movies, things of that nature. So it's basically just taking them through this like fantasy journey, which like adds this like different layer of like complexity on this entire thing, because now I think that bleeds into more of like children's social emotional learning. So around like what people are taking in. So the way that yoga exists right now is for children is it's meant to be like fun. But in this fun, it's neither trauma informed, it's not accessible, it's not at all addressing the roots of yoga or even going through the totality of the practice in all of its ways. But it's also not conducive to the way that children learn. So, the way that we can offer the practice, I feel, is to just like we cater to different audiences. And if you are at all familiar with incorporating Ayurveda into your practices, there's a lot of detail in the nuance of the timing of the practice or what's to be practiced or assessing and not putting everybody into one bucket. I think that the same thing goes for children. I think that children are also receiving this one size fits all model. And it's harmful for them in not just the ways that we as adults receive it, of like the way that we're getting yoga and how hard it can be for some bodies and how to push ourselves into places. It's also that, and it's now sensory overload for children too. So, and they're in a very strong developmental period of like how they're absorbing things around them. So the way that we're doing this is like creates a lot more problem around it. So the way that we would kind of approach your own personal practice, if teaching to others is not something you do, is making the practice accessible for the children and then catering per age group. Age group, I think, is important because children are at different developmental stages. And so understanding the need and the want of the age group of the children. This is very much based off of Montessori philosophy, which I've trained in. So it's assessing the age range of the group, the needs of the group, the wants of the group, and how is the adult to guide or support this process, the same way that we look at it as finding ourselves like as a vessel to guide or support a practice for people that are coming into this space. So being first very conscious of who it is that I'm talking to, and really rethinking like how I think the child will receive yoga and allowing the child to guide the space that we're creating for them to show up in their best possible way. So I think that age difference does matter, because then there's also differences of conversation, like how I mentioned before. Children that are older are very curious. There's a certain age that they get into asking why, and they don't stop for a very long time. And there's certain periods where like that why is very intense, and the why is like followed up with every single thing that you may explain. And so understanding that the more information and the more knowledge that you give to the child in this time of their curiosity is also shaping the way that they're taking in the practice. So oftentimes in a public school setting versus like a Montessori setting, there's a lot of ideology around how children aren't ready, or children don't have the capacity, or they don't understand. And so we want to like water down certain subjects because this is what children need. But in Montessori philosophy and how we look at social emotional learning in this school of thought, is that children are a lot more equipped than we think. They're just smaller in size and they're absorbing everything around you. And so our role as an educator and as a guide and as a parent and anyone that interacts with the child is to equip them with these tools in these sensitive periods of their life so that they can best adapt to the world around them. That's a mindset that's important going into when we think about how we're going to offer yoga to children, is how can I create the most conducive environment for the child that's receiving this practice? Because this practice very well could be shaping the way that they're not only introduced to yoga, but how they're going to now implement it into their practices and the conversations that they're going to have around it and the people that they're going to interact with based off of these conversations. So there's a larger ripple effect here, right?
So
So
I think the key is really like don't diminish that a child can really
mm,
understand what you're saying. Try not
yeah,
to reduce it to um, basically an old school mentality that a kid is a kid and they're not really
right.
capable.
Yeah. And they very much are capable. And so I think with children too, like when we're going into a space of like a typical yoga studio, when you're going in as a teacher and you have this level of knowledge, right? I think with children, it's a little bit different. I think you allow the child to guide the practice and you support. So creating that safe space for them to be able to vocalize. And like you may go in with this idea of like, oh, I want this child to relax. And so if they keep going, why, maybe we reshape that around, okay, there's a need that the child is having of wanting to understand the practice. Ultimately, the goal is to what make the practice sustainable, have this level of receptivity. But if we block off their curiosity to how they're understanding yoga, I think that could also just turn off how they're going to engage with it, or if they ever want to engage with it again, because the needs aren't being met, right? So in the same way, I think with an adult, it's to make sure that the practice feels safe for a child to be able to communicate, to be able to display their curiosity, and to be able to create those necessary changes or adjustments in not just the way that you're speaking to them, but all the shapes that you're offering to them and the education around it. So that way it seems like it's something that they want to incorporate into their lives. With children, of course, there's with that level of curiosity, I think that to some level there is an importance of keeping the child engaged. And I think there's a really fine line here of I don't think that it necessarily means like sensory overload, or we need to refer to Disney movies, or we need to have, all this music playing in the background for them to feel like this is a game, this is fun. I think having conversations around why this is important, bringing certain themes around it, and weaving certain patterns or nature around what you're doing can be equally effective and still be a lot more sustainable of a practice than to have something that's going to refer them to a cartoon. So for instance, to give you an example of something like that, if we are giving them access to tree pose, for instance, to make it a little bit more engaging, to practice with the balance, to work in with the core. Now, using this type of language with a child is going to be very difficult and likely they're going to lose interest. So, how is it that we're thinking about making them mindful with their feet, practicing the balance, practicing how weather changes show up in a tree? Things that are practical and a child can relate to and don't take them to fantasy land. That's the important part because there's a large difference between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy, I think, can turn into coping mechanisms for children at a certain point that are not healthy for them and should not be learned in a developmental stage. So to identify too in the practice, are we using the aid of fantasy, or are we working more with our imagination? Are we working more with what a child is likely to see in the outside world and adapting to, or are we taking them away from reality? That's, I think, an important question to have when we think about how we want to incorporate that. And in continuing to include ways for children to feel safe, just like we do for adults.
Yeah. And I'm like so struck by what you just said about fancy and imagination because of our work with the sutras and specifically Sutra 1.9, I believe, in understanding Vikalpa and fancy and imagination and how it's a tool, but it's a tool to be discarded.
Mm,
It's not a tool to be relied upon.
yeah.
It can be a tool in guiding meditation, but if it becomes the practice, it becomes a distracting way of daydreaming through life, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and it's just like the yoga philosophy, when taught properly to any age range, is embedded in the practice, and it's such a disservice to remove the philosophy from understanding that yoga is embedded in philosophy so that yoga can be taught without any philosophy,
Mm.
even as the underpinnings, right? Even when you're teaching a 4 or 5, 6 year old, you don't have to explain to them, don't use your imagination for too long. That's going to be detrimental when you become, 35, 40 and try X, Y, and Z. It's not about being overt with the approach. It's more about knowing this is the underpinning of the practice to begin with, so that it
Hmm.
can actually offer you different ways of giving the practice that align with the goal of yoga, whatever you name it to be. And for me, that is to
Hmm.
guide us towards more peaceful existence.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's the same. And here, I think just bleeding in a little bit of like how yoga and education intersect too. is social emotional learning is a large component of the way that academia and curriculum is set around what a child is to receive. And so thinking about fantasy and imagination from the perspective of yoga, but also again, reiterating, like thinking about that from how the child is receiving information at this vulnerable age. So fantasy can be problematic in how children can adapt and lead to difficult coping mechanisms in the manner of using fantasy to show children yoga is not necessarily helpful to their social emotional learning. And this is something that is widely discussed in Montessori philosophy of having a clear distinction. And there's something that's really important, I think, that intersects with the both of them is that the preparation of how the child is going to receive the practice starts with the adult. So very in plain words, it's set out as the preparation of the adult in Montessori philosophy, which I think is very similar to how we prepare ourselves in our own personal practice, is to first think about taking out our bias of how we want to teach, our bias of what we think the child should receive. And all the ways that we prepare ourselves when we have our own personal practice is also the way that we prepare ourselves for when the child is going to receive the practice. So knowing that 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 personal work is also imperative to when we're teaching the practice to children. To know that because we're this conduit, or because we have this larger responsibility of how the child is in an impressionable age and how they're going to receive what we're giving them, that we take out our bias, that we take out, it's a forced way for you to go further into yourself and assess and contemplate and be mindful of these ideologies around what we have with how children can receive materials, and rewire for yourself to now then be in this space where you're kind of shifting away from that space of control. And I think that in and of itself is like a deeper way for you to continue your practice with yourself. So the preparation, I think, starts with yourself, of how we have these thoughts and processes around what we think children should be around, and then clearing that out in your personal practice so that when the child is receiving what it is you have to say, they're not picking up on this energy of how you want to guide the practice, but rather just creating a safe space for them to guide it for themselves and just giving them the tools. Yoga and social emotional learning, I think, intersect in so many different ways, and it almost makes sense for them to be integrated together. Because when we think about what's the best way for children to receive and to feel space, we think about trauma-informed ways of teaching, and this could be both in yoga and also the way that you learn in a typical classroom. We think about accessibility. We think about the development of the child. So children have different developmental periods and sensitive periods in which they're adapting to the world around them. And showing yoga and the totality of itself during this period is creating that impression of them and how they're going to take it out in the world. And the same thing is of how we're providing the specific materials of how the child is going to receive education and how they want to go about it in the outside world. So in Montessori education, there is no one box of how this is the curriculum. All children fit into this curriculum. This is what we follow Monday to Friday. By the end of this quarter, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Montessori is very similar to yoga in the sense where it's very unique to each child. It's very unique to, you're allowing your impulses to guide what it is that you want to explore more of. So many of us, in the practice of yoga is vast, and many of us can find ourselves driven to certain parts of it. For me personally, I think a lot of it is meditation, a lot of it is mudra, more money work. That's something that I find myself driven in. So that impulse of mine drives how much I interact with it. And I think that has to be very similar in how we approach children, not just in yoga, but also in the education space. So when we put those together, we're working in a way that's honoring the practice, and we're also working to have that development of the child that's most conducive to their learning. So these two make sense, of teaching yoga in its totality and honoring the roots and social emotional learning of a child. And now we think of how it currently exists and how it's not catering to either one of those spaces. And so what is now the dialogue, or what is now the journey between getting to a place where we understand that yoga and social emotional learning intersect beautifully and they work well and they have similar components of how a child receives yoga. And we see the way that it's colonized and made into this fantasy, fun game, movement like situation that's neither good for their social emotional learning, their sensitive periods, their development. And it doesn't make sense because it is not at all what yoga is. How do we bridge that gap in between these two? How do we start dialogue between educators or parents or even individuals that have interactions with children? Or even if none of that is something that you resonate with, for me, it's always like inner child work, or how is it that I receive these practices? Or as I'm continuing to navigate the system, like if I think about rewiring my own work, how do I incorporate things now as I'm continuing to raise myself in many ways? So thinking about how do we get to how it currently exists to getting it to a place where it makes so much more sense for them to intersect, and how we see these parallels between two different schools of thought and how they come together to create the most accessible, most trauma informed, and most receptive way for a child to pick up the practice, honor it, and also use it as a way for them to aid in their development. And I think my biggest question in all of this is like that journey is
Mm.
getting from the difficulty around the bureaucracy of how it is, of shedding more light and awareness of how damaging it's not just going to be from a yoga perspective, but how damaging it is for the development of a child. And how do we begin to take those sustainable steps to creating that vision I have of having that parallel between both, and that being what's taught as a core curriculum through K through 12 and post-secondary education. So with that, I want to open it up to a little bit of dialogue. And you're welcome to use the chat or come off mute. And I'd love to kind of talk about this. So before I ask the question, I want to set a little bit of context. And if you'll join me to center ourselves for just a moment here, and be that the way that you do it. I think for me, it's a lot of coming into my senses, the visuals around me, what I hear. And maybe we can take a deep breath in. And as you exhale, just settling into the seat of your choice, noticing any clenching and any holding. And as we breathe out, we soften just a little bit. And here, an invitation to maybe continue to deepen the breath for a moment, bringing in that sense of clarity, finding a drishti within your breath, a point where you're focusing on the inhales, the exhales. And inviting you to bring to the screen of the mind your personal relationship of navigating the school system as a student, as a faculty member, as someone that's a part of the larger organizations of how children receive education. And maybe bringing to mind a tool that can be yoga, a part of yoga, or any other tool that you feel would have been helpful for you navigating these systems. So whether it's pranayam, whether it's a mudra, whether it's a physical practice, whether it's feeling safe, feeling heard, supported, guided, thinking about how that tool would have aided you in your development and all the different roles that you've had up until now. Now expanding that awareness outward of how this particular tool can help the future of our world. How can it help all these children that are now in the same space that we were? How does this particular tool create that ripple effect to further that dialogue, that change, into an accessible, trauma informed, appropriate, and developmentally efficient place? We'll take a deep breath in together. Inhale in deeply. Exhale, let it go. Gently fluttering the eyelids open if they were closed. And I'd love to open up some dialogue around what tool comes up for you and what could have helped in your journey. And how do you think implementing this tool in the school system can help the coming generations? You're also welcome to send a chat.
Hi, Robbie. I have lots of thoughts. Um, I think the tool that would probably um, be helpful for me was that guidance and that um, accessibility and the trauma-informed curriculum that kind of allow me and people I grew up with to be not cookie cutter versions of a curriculum that wasn't designed for people that looked like me. That way it would have been more like valuable to me. And I think while you were talking, the thing that I kept gravitating towards is that other side. It's like burn the whole system down. Because, when we think about stakeholders, who are we really talking about?
Mm,
Like, BIPOC students and their families are also stakeholders, in the educational system. Yet our interventions have to be designed in a way that doesn't make them comfortable, but makes like whiteness comfortable. And I feel like saying the quiet part out loud, which is a part of that burn it down part, is necessary in a way that we can really engage with what's actually happening. But I
mm,
also don't know how we do that.
mm, yeah. If it's any solace, I also don't know how we do that either. I think it's more just around to continue to bring that dialogue around it. But yes, in all the ways, yes, I think it's really thinking about how these practices would have almost had a different outcome and how we would have received the life around us had we had more access to them, and how they make so much more sense in these spaces that we spend more time in as children, um, and why it's important to have that now. Harpinder, I know you wanted to maybe contribute.
Yeah, I'm reading this book called The Explorer's Guide to Psychedelics.
Mm,
And in one of the beginning sentences or paragraphs, he talks about um, how he finds through research and different things, like so many of us have anxiety or depression because we have this keen sense of being disconnected from something. Like we're
mm,
not sure what it is. And from his perspective, he's like being disconnected from like spirituality, from something greater than ourselves. And I think like for me when I was high schooler, middle schooler, it would have been so nice had we had these classes where we were talking about like philosophy, where we were
mm,
talking about like different ways of being able to exist in the world outside of you get married, get a good job, then you like, and it's just a very linear path that was offered to be offered. Well, there are other paths that you can take and a whole philosophy that talks about it, how you can apply that to your life. And I find as like a high schooler, our minds are totally open for all those kinds of things. And
mm-hmm.
working at the teen mental health center where these kids have severe mental health issues. I'm like, I feel like they feel this keen sense of disconnection, but they
Mm-hmm.
don't know exactly what it is and they don't know how to find it.
Yeah.
And I think these practices offer that. They offer it in such
Oh,
a like beautiful way. So that's what came up for me.
yeah. Yeah, totally. I think it's that when we continue to shove people into boxes, it's how we better control them. And when we cut off that access to philosophy, is because philosophy is empowering. it creates a sense of autonomy within yourself. But why? We're not in the business to empower people, right? We're in the business to control. And this is a whole different conversation that I can go on for very many days. But I think this is to understand, like, there is a very almost calculated sense in why certain things are offered, because certain parts of the practice can give you a further sense of empowerment of yourself and give you autonomy, and for you to make a choice outside of this linear system. But those outliers, I think the people that really feel more sensitive to what their needs are can very much, like you're saying, in the teen mental health space, suffer detrimentally because they feel the sense of how disconnected they are, and the way that we different people that are not following this linear path. So it's like almost even thinking for a second, like there's a clear reason why it's not offered, and the vision behind why certain things are the way that they are, because it's easier to control a herd of children rather than having children having a mind of their own. Because can you imagine a world where kids guided their own development? That sounds ridiculous. Thanks, Arvinder. Irene.
Hi. Thank you so much, Rabia, and everybody for being here. For me, what you just tapped into was this sense of what I have gotten out of, and where I feel my yoga practice has taken me, as the philosophy is really was the part that was, while it was the physical asana that brought me into my practice, it was the philosophy that really changed my life and the way I live my life. And I think about, I went to public school, and, just the idea of tapping into your inner wisdom and that insight that you have, and, that you can be guided internally, which is so opposite of the way that schools are structured, and that compliance and performance and perfection and all of white culture's norms are what are valued, and how detrimental that is. And that, I just, and I share what I feel like Carrie alluded to, this overwhelm of I think about how much I would have gotten out of that, even in I think particularly about 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, right? Where I felt, bullying, and, it just, I really did feel like you felt this desire to fit in, and yet the wisdom that yoga philosophy brings is in tapping into your own instincts and inner wisdom, and guided by the yamas and the niyamas and philosophy and how you show up in the world. So, but yet not knowing how much I would have benefited from that, but then that's not the values that the school structure creates or the public school system creates. So how do you then begin to think about burning it all down and starting so that you can actually guide children in a way in which they learn? And I am surrounded by teachers, and I value what educators do so much and the limitations they deal with, but then how do we actually do the thing in space? And it can feel very overwhelming. And just very practically managing a class of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, how do you show up, even if you had the ability to run a class however, or yoga practice however you felt, the way in a decolonized way, I feel very ill-equipped to actually manage or continue to engage students or a large group of students in a classroom in an effective way. So I would teaching a decolonized version of yoga, but then also feeling ill-equipped to do that with students in a way where their attention can be maintained. I don't feel, so I share Carrie's fear of children in that regard.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Irene. if you haven't watched this show already, Abbott Elementary, I think gives a lot of insight on the journey of an educator, and how difficult it can be to be in schools that lack resources. And now try thinking, bringing like how useful yoga can be, but how hard it is to get into that space because of how we view it and how we think it's going to add more onto it, because the only way it's accepted is if it's colonized. So all of that, completely resonate with that. Thank you for sharing, Irene. Angel?
Yeah, I think I'm going to pass just in the interest of time,
Yeah.
but definitely have thoughts on that because I love the question. So I just wanted to thank you as we wrap up, and I want to drop the link in for everyone here to click and just join the interest list for the workshop in January. Like I said, this is a part one of Rabia really giving a lot of a lot of insight from your expertise, from your experience, and really from your deep, deep inquiry and deep, deep thinking through this process for yourself, what you'd like to see done differently. So I really appreciate you being able to share that with us in so many succinct ways. It's just been fascinating. But the workshop will take place on January 17th. I'm forgetting the time right now, but I will have the time listed. And it's going to be a workshop about creating trauma-informed space for teachers to offer a decolonized approach to yoga. Not not only teachers that are in the education setting. I'm guessing that it's really anyone that has the overlap of being with kids and wants to be able to talk about it in a way that a little bit like counters what maybe they're coming home with every day, so that they can start to get a wider range of experience of yoga sooner than later. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for everything you offer. I know you're going to offer a restorative poetry class in a few hours, so if you haven't signed up for that, please try. It's so great. A lot of the times people pass out for the poetry because it's just so lush. But thank you so much, Rabia. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we go?
Yeah, just last thing to reiterate what Angel said, it doesn't necessarily have to be an educator space. I think it's also any interaction that you have with child, or even if you feel that this time that we have here in our timelines is to leave this space equitable than how we found it. I think this conversation is really important. So I'd love to see you all there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so, so much. Any last words? Feel free to say bye-bye as you make your way out.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Woo! Excellent.